The morning sun cast golden rays through the tall windows of Kensington Palace as Kate stood before the mirror, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the delicate pearl necklace that had once belonged to Princess Diana. The weight of the jewelry felt heavier than usual today, not because of its physical mass, but because of what it represented. Today was not just another royal engagement. Today would mark a moment in history that would be remembered for generations. William sat on the edge of their bed, watching his wife prepare for what they both knew would be one of the most significant days of their lives. His navy uniform was pressed to perfection, hanging on the wardrobe door like a symbol of duty and tradition. But beneath the formal exterior, his heart raced with a mixture of pride and nervous anticipation. He had grown up knowing this day would come, yet nothing could have truly prepared him for the emotions that now flooded through him. "Papa, why do you look so serious?" George asked, peeking his head around the bedroom door. At 10 years old, the young prince had developed an uncanny ability to read the emotions of those around him, especially his parents. His school uniform had been replaced today with a miniature version of his father's ceremonial dress, and, despite his age, he seemed to understand the gravity of the occasion. William smiled and beckoned his eldest son into the room. "Come here, George. There's something important I want to tell you." The boy approached cautiously, his eyes wide with curiosity. William placed his hands on his son's shoulders, feeling the weight of generations pressing down on this moment. "Today, you're going to see something very special," William began, his voice gentle but filled with emotion. "We're going to Westminster Abbey, a place where our family has marked the most important moments in history for over 1,000 years. Your great-grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, was crowned there. Your grandfather, King Charles, was crowned there too. And one day, when you're much older, you might find yourself there for your own special moment." George's eyes widened as he processed his father's words. "Will there be lots of people watching us, Papa?" "Yes, son. People from all around the world will be watching. But remember, we're not just William, Kate, George, Charlotte, and Louis today. We represent something bigger than ourselves. We represent hope, tradition, and the future of our country." Down the hallway, Charlotte was having her own moment of preparation. At 8 years old, she had inherited her mother's grace and poise, but today she felt the butterflies dancing in her stomach. She stood perfectly still as her nanny helped her into the beautiful dress that had been specially designed for this occasion. The fabric felt different against her skin, more formal than anything she had ever worn to school or family gatherings. "I'm scared," she whispered to her nanny, a woman who had become like a second mother to all 3 children. "What if I do something wrong in front of all those people?" The nanny knelt down to Charlotte's level, her eyes kind and understanding. "Princess Charlotte, do you remember what your mother always tells you about being brave?" Charlotte nodded slowly. "She says being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do what's right even when you are scared." "Exactly. And today, all you need to do is be yourself. The world doesn't need you to be perfect. They need you to be genuine, to show them that even princesses can feel nervous and excited and happy all at the same time." Meanwhile, 5-year-old Louis was experiencing the day with all the wonder and confusion that comes with being the youngest member of the family. He didn't fully understand why everyone seemed so serious, why there were more people than usual rushing around the palace, or why his usual breakfast routine had been replaced with something much more formal. "Mama," he said, tugging on Kate's dress as she applied the final touches to her makeup, "why is everyone acting so funny today?" Kate set down her lipstick and lifted her youngest son on her lap, careful not to wrinkle either of their outfits. "Louis, do you remember when we went to see the Christmas lights in London, and there were so many people there to see something beautiful?" Louis nodded enthusiastically. "There were millions and millions of people. Well, today is like that, but even more special. People from all over the world want to see our family, because we represent something very important to them. We represent their country, their traditions, and their hopes for the future. But I just want to play with my toys. Lewis said with the honesty that only a 5-year-old could possess. Kate laughed softly, the sound breaking through some of the tension that had been building throughout the morning. I know, sweetheart, and after today, you'll have plenty of time for toys. But right now, we have a very important job to do. We need to show people that our family cares about them and that we're honored to serve them. As the family gathered in the main hall of Kensington Palace, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Staff members moved with practiced efficiency, making final adjustments to outfits, checking schedules, and ensuring that every detail was perfect. But beneath the professional calm, there was an undercurrent of emotion that touched everyone present. Kate took a deep breath as she looked at her family assembled before her. William stood tall and proud in his uniform, every inch the future king he was born to be. George tried to mirror his father's posture, his young face serious with concentration. Charlotte smoothed her dress nervously, but her eyes sparkled with excitement. And Lewis, bless his heart, was trying to catch dust motes dancing in the sunbeam, streaming through the window. "Before we leave," William said, his voice carrying through the hall, "I want to say something to all of you." He looked first at his children, then at Kate, and finally at the staff members who had become like extended family over the years. Today marks a moment in history that we'll all remember for the rest of our lives. But more than that, it represents our commitment to service, to each other, and to the people who look to us for leadership and inspiration. He paused, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. I think about my mother often, especially on days like this. She would have been so proud to see these 3 beautiful children, to see the incredible woman my wife has become, and to witness the love and dedication that defines our family. Though she can't be with us physically, I know she's here in spirit, guiding us and protecting us as we step into this new chapter. Kate reached for William's hand, their fingers intertwining in a gesture that spoke of years of shared experiences, challenges overcome together, and an unshakable bond that had only grown stronger with time. "Your mother lives on in all of you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but heard by everyone in the room. In George's kindness, in Charlotte's determination, in Lewis's joy, and in your unwavering commitment to duty and family. The children stood quietly, sensing the weight of the moment, even if they didn't fully understand all its implications. George stepped forward and took his father's other hand, then reached for Charlotte, who in turn took Lewis's small palm in hers. The family chain was complete, 5 individuals united by love, bound by duty, and strengthened by their shared purpose. Outside, the sound of gathering crowds could already be heard. People had been arriving since the early hours of the morning, some traveling from distant corners of the United Kingdom and beyond, all hoping to catch a glimpse of the family that represented so much to so many. The police had cordoned off the streets, and security personnel moved like shadows, invisible but ever-present. "Are you ready?" William asked, though the question was directed more to himself than to anyone else. After years of preparation, countless public engagements, and a lifetime of understanding what this moment would mean, he still felt the familiar flutter of nerves that accompanied any significant royal event. Kate squeezed his hand 3 times, a secret code they had developed early in their relationship that meant "I love you." He squeezed back 4 times, their response that meant "I love you too." It was a small gesture, but it grounded them both in the reality of their partnership and the strength they drew from each other. As they moved toward the door that would take them to their waiting car, each family member carried their own thoughts and emotions. William thought about his father, King Charles, and the pride he had seen in his eyes during their private conversation the night before. He thought about his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, and the legacy of service she had modeled throughout her remarkable life. He thought about the millions of people who would be watching today, looking to his family for stability, continuity, and hope in an uncertain world. Kate's mind wandered to her own family, the Middletons, who had supported her through every step of her journey from a middle-class girl to a future queen. She thought about her parents watching from home, probably crying with pride and worry in equal measure. She thought about the little girl she had once been, playing dress-up and pretending to be a princess, never imagining that one day the pretending would become reality. George walked with the measured steps he had been taught, but his young mind raced with excitement and anticipation. He had attended royal events before, but something about today felt different, more important. The adults around him seemed to move with extra purpose, spoke in more hushed tones, and looked at him with expressions that mixed pride with something he couldn't quite identify, but would later understand as the weight of expectation. Charlotte focused on putting one foot in front of the other, determined not to trip or stumble in front of the camera she knew would be waiting. She had inherited her mother's natural grace, but at 8 years old, self-consciousness was beginning to develop alongside her poise. She wanted to make her parents proud, to represent her family well, and to show the world that even young princesses could handle important responsibilities. Louis simply followed his siblings, his hand firmly clasped in Charlotte's, trusting that wherever they were going and whatever they were doing, it would be an adventure. At 5, he lived in the moment, unburdened by the weight of history or the pressure of public expectation. His presence served as a reminder to the rest of the family of the joy and spontaneity that could exist even within the most formal of occasions. As they approached the door, the sounds from outside grew louder. Crowds were cheering, cameras were clicking, and reporters were providing live commentary to millions of viewers around the world. But inside the palace, in that final moment before they stepped into history, there was only the sound of 5 hearts beating as one, 5 lives intertwined by love, duty, and destiny. The butler opened the door, and a wave of sound and light washed over them. The world was waiting, and the Wales family was ready to meet it together. The car journey to Westminster Abbey would take them through streets lined with well-wishers, past landmarks steeped in royal history, and toward a destination that had witnessed some of the most significant moments in British history. But before they could reach that sacred space, before they could fulfill their roles in this historic day, they had to take the first step out of the private sanctuary of their home and into the public that would follow their every move. As they walked toward their waiting vehicle, each footstep echoed with the weight of tradition and the promise of the future. The children walked between their parents, protected and guided, but also being gently introduced to the reality of their public lives. This was their world, their inheritance, and their responsibility. And today they would begin to truly understand what it meant to be not just a family, but a family that belonged to history. The sleek black car pulled away from Kensington Palace with a gentle purr, its tinted windows providing a temporary shield between the Wales family and the outside world. Inside the luxurious interior, the 5 family members sat in contemplative silence as London's familiar streets began to transform before their eyes. What would normally be a routine journey through the city had become something entirely different today. George pressed his face against the window, watching in amazement as the sidewalks filled with people. Union Jack flags fluttered in the morning breeze like a river of red, white, and blue. Some people had clearly been waiting for hours, setting up camping chairs and spreading blankets on the pavement. Others held handmade signs with messages of support and love for the royal family. "Look, Mama," Charlotte whispered, pointing to a group of school children waving enthusiastically from behind the police barriers. "They're wearing the same uniform as my friends at school." Kate followed her daughter's gaze and smiled softly. She recognized the uniform immediately. It was from a primary school in South London that she had visited just a few months earlier. The memory of that visit came flooding back. The excited children asking her dozens of questions, the teachers beaming with pride as their students performed a specially prepared song, and the little girl who had given her a drawing of the royal family made with crayons and glitter. "I remember that school," Kate said, her voice filled with warmth. The children there were so excited to meet us. And now they've come all this way to be part of this special day. William reached over and took his wife's hand, understanding the emotion behind her words. These weren't just crowds of strangers lining the streets. They were people whose lives had intersected with theirs in meaningful ways over the years. There was the elderly man in the veteran's beret who attended every royal visit in his area, always standing in the same spot with the same proud salute. There was the young mother holding a baby who couldn't be more than a few months old, wanting her child to be part of this historic moment, even if the baby wouldn't remember it. The car slowed as they approached a particularly dense crowd near Hyde Park Corner. Here, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. People of all ages had gathered together, creating a tapestry of faces that reflected the diversity and unity of modern Britain. Grandparents lifted grandchildren onto their shoulders for a better view. Teenagers held up phones to capture every second. Visitors from around the world stood alongside lifelong Londoners, all united in their desire to witness this moment in history. Louis, who had been unusually quiet since leaving the palace, suddenly perked up as he spotted something that caught his attention. "Papa, why is that lady crying?" he asked, pointing to an elderly woman near the front of the crowd who was dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. William followed his son's gaze and felt his own throat tighten with emotion. The woman appeared to be in her 80s, wearing what was clearly her finest dress and a hat adorned with a small Union Jack pin. In her weathered hands, she clutched a black and white photograph that William couldn't quite make out from this distance, but he could guess its significance. "Some people cry when they're very happy, Louis," William explained gently. "That lady has probably been looking forward to today for a very long time. She might be thinking about other special days like this one that she's seen in her lifetime, or about people she loves who aren't here to see it with her." The explanation seemed to satisfy Louis, but it resonated deeply with every adult in the car. This wasn't just a ceremonial event or a photo opportunity. It was a moment that connected past, present, and future in ways both profound and personal. For many in the crowd, this day represented continuity with loved ones who had witnessed similar moments decades earlier. For others, it was about hope for the future and the values they wanted to pass on to their children. As they continued through the heart of London, the historical significance of their route wasn't lost on any of them. They passed Buckingham Palace, where tourists pointed and waved from the gates where they had probably gathered hoping for a glimpse of the royal family. They drove along the Mall, that magnificent tree-lined avenue that had seen so many processions, celebrations, and moments of national importance throughout the centuries. Kate found herself thinking about all the brides who had traveled this same route to Westminster Abbey throughout history. Queens and princesses, nobles, and commoners who had become part of the royal story, all of them carrying their own hopes, fears, and dreams as they made their way to one of the most sacred spaces in the kingdom. She thought about her own wedding day, when she had ridden in a car not unlike this one, her stomach full of butterflies and her heart overflowing with love for the man beside her. "Do you remember our wedding day?" she asked William quietly, not wanting to disturb the children who were now absorbed in watching the crowds. William's eyes lit up with the memory. "How could I forget? You were the most beautiful bride Westminster Abbey had ever seen. I was so nervous I could barely speak during the ceremony." "You weren't the only one," Kate laughed softly. "I was terrified I would trip on my dress in front of 2 billion people. And then, when we came outside and saw all those people lining the streets, just like today, I realized that we weren't just getting married for ourselves. We were getting married for them too, in a way." The children might not have been paying attention to their parents' conversation, but they were creating their own memories of this journey. George was mentally cataloging everything he saw, knowing instinctively that this was the kind of day he would want to remember in perfect detail when he was older. Charlotte was practicing her smile and wave, wanting to be ready when the time came to greet the crowds properly. And Louis was simply enjoying the adventure, pointing out interesting sights and asking questions that ranged from practical to philosophical. As they approached Westminster, the character of the crowds began to change. Here, the gathering was more formal, more organized. International dignitaries and official cars were arriving from various directions. Security personnel were more visible. The flags weren't just British. They represented countries from around the Commonwealth and beyond, a visual reminder of the global significance of this moment. The car turned onto Victoria Street, and suddenly Westminster Abbey came into view. Even though they had seen this magnificent structure countless times throughout their lives, today it seemed to glow with special significance. The Gothic spires reached toward the gray London sky like prayers made manifest in stone. The ancient walls had witnessed nearly 1,000 years of English history, from coronations to royal weddings, from state funerals to celebrations of national achievement. "It's beautiful," Charlotte breathed, seeing the Abbey with new eyes today. "It really is," Kate agreed, feeling a familiar sense of awe wash over her. "Did you know that this building is almost 1,000 years old? People have been coming here to mark the most important moments in their lives for longer than our family has been recording its history." George, ever the thoughtful one, asked a question that was probably on all their minds. "Do you think the people who built it ever imagined that we would be coming here today?" It was William who answered, his voice thoughtful and reverent. "I think they built it hoping that people would always come here to mark moments of importance, to celebrate, to mourn, to make promises, and to honor the things that matter most in life. They probably couldn't have imagined the specific details of today, but they definitely understood that some places become sacred because of all the love, hope, and faith that people bring to them over the centuries." As their car joined the queue of official vehicles approaching the Abbey, the family could see the crowds that had gathered in the surrounding areas. Parliament Square was filled with people who had arrived early in the morning to secure good viewing positions. The lawns around the Abbey itself were dotted with officials, security personnel, and media representatives from around the world. But what struck them most was the atmosphere of celebration and reverence that seemed to emanate from every corner. This wasn't just a crowd of curious onlookers. These were people who had made a conscious decision to be part of this moment in history. Some had traveled hundreds of miles. Others had taken time off work. Many had brought their children, wanting to share this experience across generations. The car slowed to a stop about 50 meters from the Abbey's Great West door, and suddenly, the reality of the situation hit them all. In a few minutes, they would step out of this protective cocoon and into the full glare of international attention. Cameras from dozens of news organizations were positioned to capture their every move. Millions of people around the world were watching their television screens, waiting for this moment. "Is everyone ready?" William asked, though his question was as much about checking his own readiness as it was about his family's. Kate straightened her hat and smoothed her skirt, then reached over to adjust George's collar with the practiced efficiency of a mother who had prepared children for countless public appearances. "Remember what we talked about," she said to all three children. "Walk slowly, smile naturally, and stay close to Papa and me." George nodded seriously, understanding his role as the eldest and the example for his siblings. Charlotte took a deep breath and squared her shoulders, channeling the poise that seemed to come naturally to her. Louis looked up at his parents with complete trust, ready to follow their lead wherever it might take him. The car door opened, and the sound of the crowd immediately filled their vehicle. It wasn't just noise, it was a wave of emotion made audible. Cheers, applause, calls of "God, save the King," and expressions of love and support in dozens of languages created a symphony of human connection that was both overwhelming and deeply moving. William stepped out first, his movements deliberate and confident despite the butterflies in his stomach. The crowd's response was immediate and thunderous. He turned to help Kate from the car, and when she appeared in her elegant dress and perfectly positioned hat, the cheers reached a new crescendo. Together, they turned to help their children, creating a tableau that photographers around the world captured from every possible angle. The family stood together for a moment at the entrance to Westminster Abbey, five individuals who had become symbols of tradition, continuity, and hope for millions of people. The ancient stones of the Abbey seemed to welcome them, having witnessed so many similar moments throughout the centuries. The crowd's enthusiasm never wavered, but there was also a sense of reverence that acknowledged the solemnity of the occasion. As they began to walk toward the great doors of the Abbey, each step took them deeper into history and closer to their destiny. The children walked between their parents, protected and guided, but also being gently introduced to their roles as public figures. This was their inheritance, not just titles and privileges, but the responsibility to serve as symbols of the best aspirations of their nation and the Commonwealth. The doors of Westminster Abbey stood open before them, revealing the ancient interior lit by hundreds of candles and filled with the sound of an organ that had accompanied countless historic moments. Inside, heads of state, religious leaders, and representatives from around the world waited to witness this moment in history. But first, they had to complete this walk from the car to the Abbey. From the private family they had been in the car to the public symbols, they became the moment they stepped into the world's gaze. The crowd continued to cheer as they approached the threshold of the Abbey, but there was also a hush of anticipation as people realized they were witnessing something truly special. This wasn't just another royal appearance. This was a moment when the future of the monarchy was visible in the form of the family walking together toward their shared destiny. The ancient stones of Westminster Abbey seemed to whisper with the voices of centuries as the Wales family crossed the threshold from the bright London morning into the hallowed interior. The sudden transition from the thunderous cheers of the crowd to the reverent hush of the sacred space was almost breathtaking. Here, within these walls that had sheltered kings and queens, poets and statesmen, the ordinary world fell away, leaving only the weight of history and the promise of the future. The Abbey's interior was a masterpiece of light and shadow, with hundreds of candles casting dancing flames that seemed to bring the ancient stone carvings to life. Magnificent stained glass windows filtered the morning sunlight into jeweled patterns that painted the floor in brilliant blues, reds, and golds. The air itself seemed to hold the prayers and hopes of nearly 1,000 years of worshippers, creating an atmosphere so thick with reverence that even 5-year-old Lewis instinctively lowered his voice to a whisper. As they processed down the nave, guided by centuries-old protocol, but walking as a family unit, the children's eyes grew wide with wonder. Charlotte had visited the Abbey before, but never like this, never as part of such a momentous occasion. The familiar space had been transformed into something almost magical. Every pew was filled with faces that she recognized from news reports and official photographs, prime ministers and presidents, archbishops and ambassadors, all of them rising to their feet as the family passed. George walked with the measured pace he had been taught, but his young mind was racing as he tried to process everything around him. The music from the organ seemed to vibrate through the very stones beneath his feet. The scent of centuries-old wood polish and fresh flowers created an atmosphere that was both ancient and alive. Most overwhelming of all was the sense that every eye in the Abbey was focused on his family, that every person present understood they were witnessing something that would be remembered and recorded for generations to come. William felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle even more heavily on his shoulders as they walked deeper into the Abbey. This was the same aisle where he had walked to marry Catherine, where his father had processed for his coronation, where his grandmother had made her own historic journey decades earlier. The continuity was both comforting and daunting. He was part of an unbroken chain that stretched back through centuries of British history, and today, that chain was being extended to include his children in a new and profound way. Kate's eyes swept over the congregation as they processed, recognizing faces from their years of public service. There was the Archbishop of Canterbury, who had baptized all 3 of their children and whose warm smile seemed to radiate reassurance. There were representatives from charities they had worked with, people whose lives had intersected with theirs through their commitment to service. There were foreign dignitaries who had become friends over the years, and others who were meeting them for the first time, but whose presence honored the global significance of this moment. But it was the ordinary people scattered throughout the congregation that moved her most deeply. These were individuals who had been chosen to represent their communities, their organizations, their causes. A nurse from the NHS who had worked tirelessly during the pandemic. A teacher who had transformed the lives of children in an underprivileged area. A veteran who had served his country with distinction and now devoted his retirement to helping other veterans adjust to civilian life. These were the faces of modern Britain, and their presence reminded Kate that the monarchy's role was not just ceremonial, but deeply connected to the real lives of real people. As they reached their designated seats near the altar, the family arranged themselves with the practiced ease that came from years of public appearances. But there was nothing routine about this moment. The ancient ritual was unfolding around them, connecting them to every monarch who had ever sat in these same positions, every royal family that had gathered here to mark moments of profound significance. Louis, despite his young age, seemed to sense the gravity of the occasion. He sat unusually still, his small hands folded in his lap, his eyes wide as he took in the magnificent surroundings. The ceiling soared above them like a stone sky, decorated with intricate carvings that seemed to tell stories of faith, courage, and devotion. The tomb of Elizabeth I was visible to their right, a reminder that this abbey had sheltered some of the most remarkable figures in English history. The ceremony began with the sound of trumpets that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. The music was not just heard, but felt, vibrating through the stones and into the souls of everyone present. Charlotte unconsciously reached for her mother's hand, overwhelmed by the majesty of the moment, but comforted by the familiar warmth of human connection. As the service progressed, each element seemed designed to connect past, present, and future in one seamless tapestry of tradition and hope. Ancient prayers that had been spoken in this same space for centuries took on new meaning when offered on behalf of this family. This moment, this particular point in the ongoing story of the British monarchy. The words seemed to echo not just through the physical space of the abbey, but through time itself, linking this moment to countless others when royal families had gathered here to seek blessing and guidance. William found himself thinking about his mother during the most solemn moments of the ceremony. Princess Diana had never been crowned in this abbey, but her funeral had taken place here, and her presence seemed to hover over the proceedings like a benediction. He could almost feel her pride in seeing her grandchildren, so poised and dignified despite their young ages, taking their places in the continuing story of the royal family. Her influence lived on not just in their physical features. George's eyes, Charlotte's smile, Louis's mischievous spirit, but in the value she had instilled in William about the importance of connecting with ordinary people and using privilege as a platform for service. The music swelled again, this time a hymn that most of the congregation knew by heart. The sound of hundreds of voices joining together in song created a wave of emotion that was almost tangible. Foreign dignitaries who might not have known the words hummed along or simply listened with respectful attention, understanding that they were witnessing something uniquely British yet universally meaningful. Kate glanced down the row at her children and felt her heart swell with pride. George sat with the bearing of a young man far older than his years, clearly understanding the significance of the moment, even if he couldn't yet fully comprehend all its implications. Charlotte maintained perfect posture while somehow managing to look naturally relaxed, her innate grace serving her well in this most formal of settings. And Louis, bless him, was doing his absolute best to follow the proceedings with the attention span of a 5-year-old, occasionally whispering questions that made his siblings smile, despite the solemnity of the occasion. As the ceremony reached its climax, The Archbishop of Canterbury's voice rang out with words that had been spoken in this same space for nearly 1,000 years, yet which seemed fresh and meaningful in this particular moment. He spoke of service and duty, of the privilege and responsibility that came with public roles, of the importance of putting the needs of others before one's own desires. But he also spoke of family, of love, and of the human connections that make all service meaningful. The children listened with varying degrees of comprehension, but all of them seemed to understand that something important was being said about their future, about who they were expected to become, and how they were expected to live their lives. These weren't just words being spoken into the air. They were commitments being made, promises being sealed, and destinies being acknowledged. When the time came for the blessing, the entire family rose as one. The Archbishop's hands extended over them seemed to carry the weight of centuries of tradition, but also the hope of generations yet to come. In that moment, they were no longer just William and Catherine and their 3 children. They had become symbols of continuity, representatives of values that transcended any individual personality or preference, embodiments of a tradition that connected them to the deepest roots of their nation's history. The final hymn brought the congregation to their feet once more, and the sound of "God Save the King" filled every corner of the ancient building. The children sang along with voices that were still young and sweet, adding their own pure notes to a song that had been sung in honor of their family for generations. Lewis might not have known all the words, but he sang with enthusiasm what he could remember, his joy infectious even in this most solemn of settings. As the ceremony concluded, the family processed out of the abbey with the same measured pace with which they had entered, but something fundamental had changed during their time within those ancient walls. They had been marked by history, claimed by tradition, and blessed for service in a way that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The great doors of the abbey opened before them once again, revealing the crowd that had waited patiently throughout the ceremony. The cheers that greeted their reappearance were even more enthusiastic than before, as if the time spent in the sacred space had somehow intensified the connection between the royal family and the people they served. But before they stepped back into the bright London sunlight and the full attention of the world media, they paused for just a moment in the doorway of Westminster Abbey. In that threshold between the sacred and the secular, between the ancient and the modern, between the private family they had been that morning and the public symbols they had now become, they stood together as 5 individuals united by love, bound by duty, and blessed by history. The moment stretched like a held breath, filled with the weight of everything that had just occurred and the promise of everything that was yet to come. Then, together, they stepped forward into their future, carrying with them the blessings of the past and the hopes of millions of people who looked to them for leadership, inspiration, and hope. The crowds erupted in cheers once more as they emerged, but there was something different in the sound now, something deeper and more profound. These are no longer just people watching a royal appearance. They were witnesses to history, participants in a moment that would be remembered and celebrated for generations to come. They had seen a family transformed by tradition, blessed by history, and committed to service in the most public and permanent way possible. As they began their journey back through the streets of London, past the crowds and the cameras and the flags, they carried with them not just the memory of this extraordinary day, but the responsibility that had been placed upon them within the walls of Westminster Abbey. They were no longer just the Wales family. They had become part of the continuing story of the British monarchy, links in a chain that stretched back through centuries and would continue forward through their children and their children's children. The ancient stones of Westminster Abbey settled back into their eternal silence, but the echoes of this day would resonate through them forever, adding another layer to the rich tapestry of history that these walls had witnessed. And somewhere in the sacred space they had just left, the spirits of all the kings and queens who had gone before seemed to whisper their approval and their blessing on the family that would carry their legacy into the future. The journey back through London's historic streets felt entirely different from their arrival earlier that morning, where there had been nervous anticipation just hours before. Now there was a sense of profound accomplishment and transformation. The Wales family had entered Westminster Abbey as individuals carrying the weight of expectation. They emerged as a unit that had been fundamentally changed by the ancient rituals and sacred promises they had participated in. The crowds lining the streets seemed to sense this transformation as well. Their cheers were warmer now, more personal, as if they had witnessed something that brought them closer to this family they had long admired from a distance. Children who had been lifted onto their parents' shoulders that morning were now waving flags with tired but happy arms. Elderly spectators who had arrived before dawn dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs, overcome by emotion at having witnessed such a significant moment in history. Inside the car, the family sat in comfortable silence for the first few minutes, each lost in their own thoughts about what had just occurred. The ceremony had been months in the planning, but nothing could have prepared them for the emotional intensity of the actual experience. Now, as the adrenaline began to fade, they were left with the profound realization that their lives had been irrevocably marked by this day. Lewis was the first to break the silence, his 5-year-old perspective cutting through the weight of the moment with characteristic directness. "Papa, that was really long," he said, though his tone suggested he had enjoyed the experience despite its duration. "And really beautiful. But I'm hungry now." The comment broke the tension that had been building in the car, and suddenly, everyone was laughing. William reached over and ruffled his youngest son's hair, grateful for the reminder that beneath all the ceremony and tradition, they were still a family with very human needs and concerns. "You're right, Lewis," Kate said, her voice lighter now than it had been all morning. "It was long, and it was beautiful, and you were absolutely perfect throughout all of it. When we get home, we'll have a proper lunch, and you can tell us all about your favorite parts of the day." Charlotte, who had maintained her composure throughout the ceremony with remarkable poise for an 8-year-old, finally allowed some of her excitement to show. "Did you see all those people singing?" she asked, her eyes bright with wonder. It was like the whole world was singing together, and the music was so loud it made my chest feel funny, but in a good way. George, ever thoughtful, had been processing the experience on a deeper level. "I keep thinking about what the Archbishop said about service," he said, his young face serious beyond his years. "How we're supposed to put other people first and use our positions to help make things better. It feels like a really big responsibility." William turned to face his eldest son, recognizing the weight that George was already beginning to understand. "It is a big responsibility, son, but you don't have to carry it alone. We're a family, and we'll help each other learn how to serve well. And remember, you have many years to grow and learn before the full weight of these responsibilities falls on your shoulders." The conversation was interrupted by the sight of yet another crowd gathered at Hyde Park Corner, this one consisting largely of school children who had been given permission to leave their classes early to witness this historic moment. Their teachers stood behind them, many of them clearly moved by the significance of the day and the opportunity to share it with their students. Kate watched the children waving from behind the barriers and felt her heart swell with emotion. These young faces represented the future that her family had just committed to serving. These were the children who would grow up during her husband's reign, who would look to their family for stability and guidance during times of challenge and change. "Wave to them," she encouraged her own children. "Those children will remember this day for the rest of their lives. They'll tell their own children about the time they saw the royal family on one of the most important days in recent history." All 3 children pressed their faces to the windows and waved enthusiastically, their genuine delight in connecting with their young contemporaries evident in their smiles. The response from the crowd was immediate and joyful, with teachers and students alike cheering and waving back with renewed enthusiasm. As they continued through the city, the family began to notice details they had missed on their way to the Abbey. street vendors selling commemorative flags and programs, families who had set up elaborate picnics on the sidewalks, complete with Union Jack tablecloths and sandwiches cut into crown shapes. Tourists from around the world, identifiable by their cameras and guidebooks, who had timed their visits to London specifically to be part of this historic day. But it was the everyday Londoners who moved them most deeply. The bus driver who had pulled over to let his passengers get a better view. The shop owners who had stepped outside their businesses to applaud as the royal car passed. The construction workers who had put down their tools and removed their hard hats in a gesture of respect. These were people going about their normal lives who had chosen to pause and become part of this extraordinary moment. "It's humbling," William said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else, but Kate heard him and understood exactly what he meant. The responsibility they had just accepted wasn't just about wearing crowns or attending state functions. It was about being worthy of the trust and faith that millions of ordinary people placed in their family every single day. As they approached the familiar gates of Kensington Palace, the children began to perk up with anticipation of returning home. But home would feel different now, they all sensed. The palace that had sheltered their private family life would now also serve as the headquarters for their more public roles. The rooms where they played games and did homework would also be the spaces where they prepared for increasingly important public engagements. The car pulled through the palace gates, and suddenly they were back in their private world, away from the cameras and the crowds. The contrast was stark but welcome. Here, they could begin the process of absorbing and understanding everything that had just occurred. As they walked back into their home, each family member seemed to move a little differently. William carried himself with the bearing of a man who had just made the most serious commitments of his life in the most public way possible. Kate moved with the grace of a woman who had accepted her role as a future queen not just in theory, but in sacred ceremony. The children walked with the careful steps of young people who were beginning to understand that their childhood, while still precious and protected, would be different from that of their peers. The first thing they did was gather in the family room, the same space where they had eaten breakfast just hours earlier, but which now felt like it belonged to a different lifetime. Here, surrounded by the comfortable furniture and family photographs that made this palace feel like home, they could finally begin to process the magnitude of what they had experienced. "I think we should talk about today," William said, settling into his favorite chair and gesturing for his family to gather around him. "What we experienced, what it means, and how we're feeling about everything." Charlotte was the first to speak, her 8-year-old wisdom sometimes startling in its clarity. "I felt scared and excited and proud all at the same time," she said. "Scared because so many people were watching us, excited because it was so beautiful and special, and proud because I'm proud to be part of our family." George nodded in agreement with his sister's assessment. "I kept thinking about all the kings and queens who have been in that same place before us," he added. "It made me feel connected to something really big and important, but also like I need to work really hard to be worthy of it." Lewis, not to be left out, contributed his own perspective with characteristic honesty. "I liked the singing and the pretty windows and how everyone was so happy to see us. But my legs got tired from standing so much." Kate laughed and pulled her youngest son onto her lap. "Those are all perfectly reasonable reactions, sweetheart. Even grown-ups get tired legs from standing for long ceremonies." William looked at each of his children in turn, his heart overflowing with pride and love. "I want you all to know how proud I am of how you conducted yourselves today," he said. "You represented our family and our country with dignity and grace. But more than that, you were genuinely yourselves, kind, curious, and caring. That's the most important thing." As the afternoon progressed, they found themselves revisiting different moments from the day, each family member remembering different details and emotions. Kate talked about the feeling of walking down the aisle of Westminster Abbey, knowing that millions of people around the world were watching and that this moment would become part of history. William spoke about the weight of the promises he had made and his determination to honor them throughout his life. The children, in their innocent way, asked the questions that adults might have been too polite to voice. Why did some people in the crowd cry when they saw them? What would happen if they made mistakes in their future public roles? How would they know if they were doing a good job at being royal? These conversations, held in the comfort of their family home, began the process of helping the children understand not just what had happened that day, but what it would mean for the rest of their lives. They were no longer just the prince and princess of Wales's children. They were young people with defined roles in the constitutional monarchy, with expectations that would follow them wherever they went. But perhaps most importantly, the day had reinforced their identity as a family unit. The ceremony had been about individual roles and responsibilities, but their experience of it had been fundamentally collective. They had supported each other through the nervousness of the morning, the solemnity of the ceremony, and now the reflection of the afternoon. As evening approached and the excitement of the day began to give way to exhaustion, the family settled into their normal evening routine. Homework for the older children, bath time for Lewis, and the familiar rituals that marked the end of any day in their household. But even these ordinary activities felt different now, imbued with the memory of the extraordinary day they had shared. The last official act of the day was a private moment of thanksgiving in their own home. William led his family in a prayer of gratitude for the honor they had been given, for the support of the people who had lined the streets, and for the strength to live up to the trust that had been placed in them. It was a quiet, intimate moment that provided a stark contrast to the public ceremony of the morning, but which felt equally significant in its own way. As the children were tucked into their beds that night, each of them carried with them the memories of a day that had changed their lives forever. They had seen the power of tradition and ceremony to connect people across generations and nations. They had experienced the weight of public expectation and the warmth of public support. Most importantly, they had learned that being part of the royal family meant belonging to something much larger than themselves, a tradition of service that would define their lives and their purpose for decades to come. The palace settled into quiet as night fell over London, but the echoes of the day's events would resonate through their lives forever. They had participated in a moment in history, and in doing so, they had become part of history themselves. The little family that had nervously left their home that morning had returned as symbols of continuity, hope, and service, ready to face whatever challenges and opportunities the future might bring, secure in their love for each other and their commitment to the people they had sworn to serve.